100 tons of mustard gas sat in the hold of an American cargo ship, docked in a crowded harbor, and not a single doctor on shore knew it was there. In the autumn of 1943, the Allied advance through Italy was grinding forward, and the port of Bari on the Adriatic coast had become a critical supply artery. Ships arrived daily carrying ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment for the campaign, pushing north toward Rome. But one vessel among them carried something different. The SS John Harvey, a Liberty ship that had crossed the Atlantic from Baltimore, held in its cargo holds approximately 2,000 M47A1 mustard gas bombs, chemical munitions shipped under the authority of the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service. The official justification was deterrence. Intelligence reports suggested Germany might resort to chemical weapons on the Italian front, and Allied planners wanted a retaliatory stockpile positioned in theater. President Roosevelt had publicly declared that the United States would never use chemical weapons first, but would respond in kind if attacked with them. And so the bombs were loaded in Baltimore and sent across the ocean under a veil of secrecy so complete that even the John Harvey's captain was not fully briefed on the nature of his cargo until the ship was underway. What no one could have predicted, what wouldn't fully surface for over 40 years, was that this hidden stockpile would turn an enemy air raid into one of the worst chemical disasters of the Second World War. By late November 1943, Bari Harbor was dangerously overloaded. More than 30 Allied cargo vessels sat anchored in tight formation, waiting to offload supplies for the Italian campaign. The port was operating around the clock, and still it couldn't keep pace with demand. Ships queued for berths. Cranes swung day and night. The John Harvey sat among them, waiting its turn, its lethal cargo still untouched in the hold. Captain John Gruber, the harbor master at Bari, saw what was coming. He raised the alarm about the congestion, warning that so many ships packed into such a confined space created an inviting target for air attack. But his concerns were brushed aside. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Conyngham, commanding the Northwest African Tactical Air Force, had publicly assured reporters that the Luftwaffe in the region was effectively finished. He considered the skies over Bari secure. Anti-aircraft defenses at the port were minimal. The harbor lights stayed on at night to facilitate round-the-clock unloading. It was a calculation built on confidence, and it was catastrophically wrong. At approximately 7:30 on the evening of December 2nd, 1943, 105 German Ju-88 bombers swept in over the Adriatic. The attack force belonged to Luftflotte 2, and it struck with devastating precision. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief South, had ordered the raid to cripple Allied supply lines feeding the Italian front, and his pilots found conditions beyond anything they could have hoped for. The harbor was lit up. Ships sat clustered together like targets on a range. Anti-aircraft response was slow and disorganized. The attack lasted roughly 20 minutes. In that narrow window of time, German bombs sank 17 Allied ships and damaged 8 more. Fuel stores erupted. Ammunition detonated. Fires tore across the waterfront and leapt from vessel to vessel. The harbor became a wall of flame and smoke visible for miles along the coast. The press would later call it the Second Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor had not carried a secret that would poison its own survivors. When the bombs struck the SS John Harvey, the ship did not merely sink. It detonated. The blast ripped open the hull and released the contents of 2,000 mustard gas bombs into the harbor. Liquid mustard agent poured into the water and mixed with the fuel oil already spreading from dozens of ruptured ships. The result was a toxic slick that coated the surface of the harbor, invisible in the darkness, indistinguishable from ordinary oil to anyone struggling in the water. Rescue workers rushed to pull survivors from the burning harbor. They dragged oil-soaked men onto docks and into boats, not knowing that the dark film covering these men's skin and saturating their uniforms was laced with one of the most vicious chemical agents ever weaponized. Survivors stood in their soaked clothing for hours, waiting for transport to hospitals, the mustard agent slowly burning through their skin with every passing minute. No one ordered decontamination. No one could have. The chemical warfare cargo was classified. The rescue workers, the doctors waiting at hospitals, the survivors themselves, None of them had any idea what was in that water. Within hours, the hospitals of Bari and the surrounding area began filling with patients whose symptoms defied explanation. Men presented with massive chemical burns across their bodies, blistering skin, and eyes swollen shut. Temporary blindness struck dozens. Then came the respiratory failures, lungs filling with fluid, men drowning from the inside. These injuries did not look like blast wounds or conventional burns. Doctors had never seen anything like it, and they had no information to work with. No one from Allied command contacted the hospitals to warn them about possible chemical exposure. Physicians treated what they could see, but patients continued to deteriorate. White blood cell counts plummeted. Men who had seemed stable crashed without warning. The dying accelerated. Within the first month, 83 military personnel were dead from exposure. An estimated 628 servicemen in total suffered mustard gas contamination. The civilian toll in Bari itself, men, women and children who lived near the waterfront, was never fully counted but likely reached into the hundreds. The doctors needed answers, but the answers were classified. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Francis Alexander arrived in Bari as a specialist, a chemical warfare consultant attached to the U.S. Army Medical Corps. He had been dispatched to investigate the unusual pattern of casualties. What he found confirmed what the symptoms had already been screaming. Alexander conducted autopsies. He examined the living. He studied the burns, the blindness, the collapsed immune systems. The evidence was unmistakable. These men had been exposed to mustard gas. He traced the contamination back through the harbor water, through the oil slick, and ultimately to the cargo of the SS John Harvey. His report was meticulous. He documented exposure patterns, mapped how the agent had spread through the rescue chain, and catalogued the mortality data with clinical precision. But Alexander also noticed something else, something unexpected. In patient after patient, the nitrogen mustard had dramatically suppressed white blood cell production. The agent was destroying rapidly dividing cells with terrifying efficiency. Alexander recorded this observation carefully in his report. He could not have known it then, but that detail buried in a classified document about a suppressed disaster would eventually help reshape modern medicine. But first, his findings had to survive what came next. Alexander's report went up the chain of command, and the chain of command closed around it like a fist. Eisenhower's headquarters imposed a total secrecy classification on the Bari incident. Every detail related to chemical munitions was locked down. The Allied press corps was told nothing about mustard gas. The official narrative was simple. An enemy air raid had caused conventional damage, and casualties had resulted from burns, blast injuries, and drowning. Nothing more. Winston Churchill went further. He personally ordered that all British medical records classify the deaths as burns due to enemy action, deliberately excising any reference to chemical weapons. British sailors and soldiers who had been poisoned by their own side's stockpile were officially recorded as conventional casualties. Their files were scrubbed clean. The consequences for survivors were devastating. Men who had been exposed to mustard gas were never told what had actually poisoned them. They were discharged with injuries that had no accurate medical explanation in their records. When they sought treatment years later for chronic respiratory problems, skin conditions, or cancers that could be traced to mustard exposure, their files told a different story, one that made them ineligible for the care they needed. The cover-up did not end at classification. It followed these men home and into their doctors' offices for the rest of their lives. The Bari disaster did not enter public consciousness for nearly 3 decades. In 1971, American author and military historian Glenn B. Infield published a book that brought the first significant public attention to the event, drawing on declassified fragments and survivor accounts. But even then, official acknowledgments remained elusive. Governments on both sides of the Atlantic kept the full documentary record sealed. It was not until the 1980s, more than 40 years after that night in December 1943, that the relevant documents were finally declassified and the truth was formally acknowledged. By then, many of the survivors were already dead, having lived their entire post-war lives without knowing what had poisoned them, without receiving proper recognition, and without access to medical treatment appropriate to their actual injuries. The darkest irony of Bari lies in what emerged from Alexander's suppressed report. His observation that nitrogen mustard destroyed rapidly dividing cells became a foundation stone in the development of chemotherapy. The very agent that had killed and maimed hundreds of men in a harbor in southern Italy was refined and redirected against cancer cells. Modern oncology owes a quiet debt to a catastrophe that was buried for decades. No conspiracy was needed to keep Bari hidden. Only the ordinary machinery of wartime secrecy, amplified by institutional self-preservation and the quiet agreement of powerful men that some truths were too inconvenient to acknowledge. The soldiers who choked on mustard gas in that burning harbor deserved better than silence. They got silence anyway for 40 years.